The first thing I saw when I came home from 8 months overseas was not my wife. It was my mother sleeping inside an old sedan in a Walmart parking lot. And when my father finally told me why they were there, I realized my marriage had already ended. I just didn't know it yet. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 40 years old, and after 8 months away on deployment, I had imagined my return 100 different ways. I pictured my wife, Claire, waiting at our front door. I pictured a warm meal, my own bed, the quiet comfort of being home after months of heat, exhaustion, and phone calls that always seemed to disconnect before I could say everything I wanted. Instead, for hours after landing, I was sitting in the back seat of my father's aging Buick, watching my mother sleep against the window. She looked smaller than I remembered. Her clothes were wrinkled. Her face was pale, and there were dried tear marks beneath her eyes. My father, Ray Mercer, was behind the wheel. He was 72 years old, a mechanic who had spent his entire life fixing other people's broken things. But that morning, he couldn't fix what had happened to his own family. On the dashboard was a photograph of my younger sister, Lily. The frame was cracked. The edges were blackened by smoke. 6 years earlier, Lily had been killed by a drunk driver while coming home from college. She had been 25 and wanted to become a nurse. My mother had carried that photograph out of the burning house. Not jewelry, not money, not clothes, just Lily. Because sometimes a mother's hands know exactly what matters before her mind has time to understand what's happening. The fire had destroyed nearly everything my parents owned. Their home of 37 years was gone. Their savings couldn't cover what insurance wouldn't. And when they had nowhere else to go, they called my wife. They didn't ask her to take care of them forever. They didn't ask for money. They asked for one simple thing: a place to sleep. Just for a few nights. Claire opened the door. She looked at my parents standing there in smoke-stained clothes, barefoot, exhausted, with Lily's damaged photograph pressed against my mother's chest. Then Claire told them she couldn't have them staying in her house. My father asked again, just for one night. She still said no. So my parents went back to their car, and they stayed there for 12 nights. I knew none of this when my plane landed. I called Claire first. She sounded completely normal. Then I called my father. He answered after several rings. "Hey son." 2 words. That's all it took. I knew something was wrong. Minutes later, I was driving straight to that Walmart parking lot instead of going home. And when I opened that back door and saw my mother wake up and realize I was standing there, something inside me broke. She covered her mouth. She didn't scream. She didn't complain. She simply whispered, "You're home." I held her while my father stared through the windshield. Then I looked at Lily's cracked photograph on the dashboard. And for the first time, I understood something terrifying. The fire had destroyed my parents' house. But Claire had made a choice that could destroy mine. And I was about to find out exactly what kind of woman I'd married. I drove my parents home that night. Not to my house. Not yet. I needed to see Claire's face before I made another decision. My father kept telling me to slow down. "Daniel, don't do anything angry." I almost laughed. Angry? I had spent 8 months overseas learning how to control anger, because losing control could get someone killed. But seeing my 72-year-old father sleep in a car after losing his home was different. This wasn't anger. This was something colder. When I finally walked through the front door, Claire was sitting on the couch with her phone in her hand. She looked up and smiled. "You're home early." I stared at her. She had no idea where I'd been. No idea that I'd just found my parents sleeping in a parking lot. No idea that the woman she called family had spent 12 nights sleeping beside a grocery cart return. Or maybe she knew. That thought hurt more than anything else. I put my bag down. Then I asked quietly, "Where are my parents sleeping tonight?" Her smile disappeared. "What? My parents? Where are they sleeping?" Claire placed her phone on the coffee table. "Daniel, I already told them they couldn't stay here." "You told them that?" "Yes. They lost their house." "I know what happened." "No, Claire. I don't think you do." She crossed her arms. "They came here without asking me." I stared at her. "My mother was barefoot." She said nothing. My father hadn't eaten since the afternoon. Still nothing. They were standing outside our door in the middle of the night after watching their entire home burn. Claire sighed. "Daniel, I can't suddenly become responsible for 2 adults." I felt something inside me go quiet. "You weren't being asked to become responsible for them. That's how it starts." "What?" "1 night. Then a week. Then suddenly they're living here." I looked around our 3-bedroom house. There was a guest room that had been empty for years. A room with a perfectly good bed. A room my parents could have slept in without disturbing anyone. You had a room, I said. Claire shook her head. I needed my space. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My mother had spent decades welcoming people into her home. She had cooked for neighbors, helped relatives, remembered birthdays, and treated Claire like a daughter. My father had never asked anyone for anything unless he could repay it. And when they finally needed help, Claire had closed the door. I asked her one more question. Did my mother beg you? Claire looked annoyed. I don't know. She did, didn't she? Claire didn't answer. That silence told me enough. I turned toward the hallway. Where are you going? To get them. Daniel, don't make this dramatic. I stopped. Then I turned around. Dramatic? She looked away. I lowered my voice. My parents lost their home. My sister's photograph is the only thing my mother managed to save. They've been sleeping in a car for 12 nights, Claire. Her expression hardened. And whose fault is that? For a second, I couldn't breathe. Then she said the sentence I would remember long after everything else had disappeared. They're not my parents, Daniel. There it was. Not an accident. Not confusion. A choice. I went outside without another word. My parents had 2 grocery bags containing nearly everything they owned. I loaded them into my car. My mother kept apologizing. She apologized for the bags, for the inconvenience, for needing somewhere to sleep. I finally turned around and said, Mom, stop apologizing. Her eyes filled with tears. You're my mother. She looked down at Lily's photograph. Then she whispered, I didn't want to ruin your homecoming. That sentence nearly destroyed me. I drove them to my house. I made up the guest room. I cooked chicken soup using the recipe my mother had taught me when I was 12. And when my father sat at the kitchen table, staring at the bowl without touching it, I realized something. The woman I had married had shown me exactly who she was. But she wasn't finished. Because over the next few days, Claire didn't apologize. She started making my parents feel like prisoners in the house I had built with her. And by the 7th morning, I was going to discover just how far she was willing to go to make them leave. For the first 2 days, I told myself Claire was simply overwhelmed. I wanted to believe that. Maybe she needed time to adjust. Maybe seeing my parents suddenly living in our guest room had frightened her. Maybe the woman I had known for 9 years was still somewhere underneath all that irritation. I was wrong. By the 4th morning, Claire had turned our home into a place where my parents were afraid to breathe too loudly. My mother woke before 6 every morning. She would quietly make her bed, fold her pajamas, and walk downstairs as if she were sneaking through someone else's house. One morning, I found her wiping the kitchen counter even though it was already spotless. Mom, what are you doing? She looked startled. Nothing. I just thought Claire might want it clean. You don't have to clean. I know. But she kept wiping. Then she whispered, I don't want her thinking we're taking advantage of you. That hurt. These were the same parents who had once opened their home to me without asking for anything. Now my mother was scared that using the bathroom too often might make her a burden. My father was no different. He spent most mornings on the back porch with his coffee. He barely spoke. He had always been a quiet man, but this was different. His silence had weight. One afternoon, I sat beside him. You okay, Dad? He stared toward the backyard. I'm fine. You don't have to pretend with me. He took a slow breath. Then he said, Son, your wife doesn't want us here. I didn't answer, because we both knew he was right. Inside the house, Claire had started making little comments. Nothing dramatic enough to justify a confrontation. That was what made them so cruel. Oh, those are the good towels. Or, I thought we agreed everyone would clean up after themselves. Or, some people are used to having more help than others. She always said them casually, almost politely, but my mother heard every word. So did I. The worst part was watching Mom change. She stopped cooking. She stopped watching television in the living room. She even began asking permission before taking food from the refrigerator. One evening, I walked into the kitchen and found her standing there with a bowl in her hands. What are you doing? She smiled nervously. Claire said the leftovers were for tomorrow. I looked at the bowl, then at my mother. You don't need permission to eat in my house. Her eyes immediately filled with tears. She looked away. I know, but she didn't. Not anymore. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around 2 in the morning, I walked downstairs and found the kitchen light on. Mom was sitting alone at the table. Lily's photograph was in front of her. The new damage from the fire had left a dark stain along one corner of the picture. I pulled out the chair beside her. Can't sleep? She shook her head. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then she touched Lily's face through the glass. She would have been 31 now. I smiled despite the pain. Yeah. Mom laughed softly. She would have been impossible at 31. She already was. Mom laughed again. For a few seconds, she sounded like herself. Then the smile disappeared. She used to say family was the only thing worth fighting for. I looked at her. Sounds like Lily. Mom's fingers tightened around the frame. I just wish I hadn't had to learn that lesson twice. My chest tightened. I knew exactly what she meant. First, we had lost Lily. Now, my mother had discovered that someone she believed was family could look directly at her suffering and still choose comfort over compassion. I reached across the table and held her hand. You're never sleeping in a car again. She squeezed my fingers. I don't want you to lose your marriage because of us. I stared at her. And that's when I finally understood. My mother was still protecting Claire. Even after Claire had abandoned her. I went upstairs. Claire was asleep. I stood in the bedroom doorway and watched her for several seconds. Then I looked at the wedding ring on my finger. For years, I had believed marriage meant standing beside someone through the hardest moments of life. But Claire had just shown me what she would do when the people I loved became inconvenient. The next morning, I made a decision. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to insult her. And I wasn't going to threaten her. I was going to ask one question. A question that would force Claire to choose between the marriage she claimed to love and the comfort she refused to sacrifice. And once she answered it, there would be no way back. The next morning, I waited until my parents had gone outside. Dad was on the porch, pretending to read an old newspaper. Mom was in the backyard, checking the few flowers she had managed to bring with her. Then I walked into the kitchen. Claire was drinking coffee. She looked at me and immediately knew something was different. What? I pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Claire, we need to talk. She sighed. I don't want another argument. Neither do I. I kept my voice calm. That was important. Because if I yelled, she could make the conversation about my anger. If I insulted her, she could make herself the victim. I wasn't giving her either opportunity. I looked directly into her eyes. I'm not asking you to love my parents the way I do. She raised an eyebrow. Good. But they loved you. Her expression changed slightly. My mother made you that quilt. Daniel. 3 months, Claire. She sat at that table almost every night sewing it by hand. I appreciated it. You put it in a closet. Claire rolled her eyes. Are we really talking about a quilt? No. I leaned forward. I'm talking about the woman who made it. She stared at me. My mother lost her home. She lost almost everything she owned. She stood outside this house after midnight with no shoes, smoke in her hair, and Lily's photograph in her hands. Claire looked down at her coffee. And you closed the door. I was protecting my home. From my mother? From what comes after letting people move in. I shook my head. They weren't asking to move in permanently. You don't know that. Yes, I do. How? Because I know my parents. Claire became quiet. I could hear the refrigerator humming behind her. For years, I had imagined difficult conversations with my wife. I imagined tears. Maybe shouting. Maybe both of us saying things we didn't mean and eventually apologizing. But this wasn't like that. There was no confusion left. I finally understood her. And that realization hurt more than the betrayal itself. Claire, I said, I spent days trying to find a way to forgive what happened. She looked at me. I kept thinking maybe there was some explanation I wasn't seeing. There is an explanation. I know. I swallowed. You chose your comfort over 2 people who had nowhere else to go. Her face hardened. They are not my responsibility. No. But they are my family. And I'm your wife. Yes. She leaned forward. So what are you saying? There it was. The question underneath every argument we'd had since I came home. I looked toward the hallway. My parents were somewhere outside. They had no idea this conversation was happening. I thought about Dad sleeping upright behind a steering wheel. I thought about Mom waking up in that car and pretending she wasn't scared. I thought about Lily's photograph sitting on that dashboard. Then I looked back at Claire. I need to know something. What? If you had to make the same choice again, would you open that door? Claire didn't hesitate. No. One word. No hesitation. No regret. No apology. Just no. Something inside me finally broke free. Not my anger. My hope. I nodded slowly. Then I have my answer. Claire's eyes narrowed. Answer to what? To whether this marriage can survive. She stared at me as though I'd just spoken another language. You're choosing them over me? I took a breath. I'm choosing not to abandon them. That's not what I asked. Yes, Claire. My voice was quiet. I'm choosing my parents. Her chair scraped backward. You'll regret this. Maybe she expected me to fight. Maybe she expected me to beg. Maybe she expected me to suddenly remember every good year we'd shared and decide one terrible decision couldn't erase them. But all I could see was my mother sleeping against that car window. Maybe, I said. Claire stared at me. I stood. But I won't regret helping the people who raised me. I started walking away. Then I stopped at the doorway. There was one final thing I needed her to understand. You know what hurts the most? She said nothing. You didn't have to fix their lives. I turned around. You didn't have to give them money. You didn't have to become their caretaker. You didn't even have to like having them in the house. Her expression remained cold. You only had to open the door. Silence. That was all they needed. I walked away. For the first time since coming home, I felt strangely calm, because the hardest decision had already been made. The paperwork hadn't been filed. The house hadn't been divided. Nothing official had happened yet. But in my heart, my marriage was already over. What Claire didn't know was that within the next 2 weeks, I would make a decision that would change all 4 of our lives. And this time, I wasn't going to ask Claire for permission. I didn't file for divorce that morning. I could have. Part of me wanted to walk into the courthouse immediately, put an end to everything, and never hear Claire's voice again. But I knew my parents had already lost enough. They didn't need to watch their son destroy his life in the middle of their own disaster. So I waited. Not for Claire. For them. That afternoon, I sat with Dad on the back porch. He was holding a cup of coffee, staring at the yard. After several minutes, he said, "You don't have to do this because of us." I looked at him. Do what? End your marriage. My jaw tightened. Dad, this isn't because of you. Yes, it is. No. He finally turned toward me. Daniel, your mother and I can figure something out. I almost lost my temper. You slept in a car for 12 nights. Dad looked away. I've slept in worse places. That doesn't make it okay. He didn't respond. I leaned forward. Do you know what I keep thinking about? Dad shook his head. The night you picked Mom up and carried her out of that house. His eyes dropped to his coffee. You didn't stop to think about what you were leaving behind. There wasn't time. Exactly. I swallowed hard. When someone you love needs you, you don't start calculating what it's going to cost. Dad looked at me for a long moment. Then he quietly said, "Your mother would tell you not to throw away your future because of us." I know. And she's wrong. For the first time that day, Dad smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the kind a father gives when his son finally says something he has been hoping to hear. 3 days later, I started looking for a place for my parents. I didn't tell Claire. I didn't ask her opinion. I simply searched until I found a small rental house on Briarwood Lane. It wasn't fancy. 2 bedrooms. A narrow front porch. A small patch of dirt in the backyard where Mom could plant flowers. The kitchen was old, but the windows filled the room with afternoon sunlight. Mom stood in the doorway when I showed it to her. You found this? Yeah. She looked around. Daniel, we can't afford something like this. I can. Her face changed immediately. No. Mom. No. You already lost your home with us. I didn't lose anything. She stared at me. I stepped closer. Mom, you spent my entire childhood giving me things you couldn't afford. Her eyes filled. You bought my school clothes when you needed new shoes. Daniel, you stayed awake when I was sick. You drove me to every appointment. You sat beside me when I failed my first driving test. Dad laughed from the doorway. You nearly drove through a garage. I was 16. You were terrible. Mom laughed through her tears. For a few seconds, everything felt normal. Then I looked around that empty house. It didn't feel like a rental anymore. It felt like a beginning. We moved them in the following weekend. Mom unpacked slowly. She placed Lily's photograph on the mantel. The cracked frame was still there. I had bought a new wooden frame, but Mom refused to throw the old one away. Maybe someday, she said, I'll know how to let it go. I understood. Some things aren't meant to be thrown away just because they're broken. Dad spent his first afternoon repairing a loose cabinet. The landlord hadn't even asked him to. That's Dad. He could lose his house, his tools, his savings, almost everything he owned, and still find a way to fix somebody else's broken cabinet. That evening, Mom planted yellow flowers along the porch. She stood there with dirt beneath her fingernails and smiled. I hadn't seen that smile since before the fire. And for the first time since returning home, I felt like maybe we were going to be okay. But when I drove back to my own house, Claire was waiting. She was standing in the living room with her arms crossed. You moved them out. I put my keys on the table. Yes. You didn't even discuss it with me. I looked at her. There's nothing left to discuss. Her face hardened. You're really doing this? I am. She stepped closer. Daniel, think carefully. You are destroying our marriage over something that happened during a crisis. I stared at her. No, Claire. Her expression shifted. You destroyed it when my parents were standing outside this house. Silence. Then she asked the question I knew was coming. So what happens now? I looked at the woman I had once promised forever. And strangely, I didn't feel hatred. I felt grief. Because I wasn't mourning the marriage we had. I was mourning the marriage I thought we had. 12 days, I said. What? Give me 12 days. Her eyes narrowed. For what? To make arrangements. To separate our lives without turning this into another war. She stared at me. Then she walked away. I stood alone in the living room. And for the first time, I understood that leaving someone doesn't always feel like freedom. Sometimes it feels like burying a future you spent years believing you would have. 12 days later, I would sign the first document. But before that happened, Claire would make one final attempt to convince me that I was the one being cruel. And what she said to me then would reveal something I hadn't known about her at all. 12 days passed faster than I expected. I had spent those days separating a life that had taken almost a decade to build. Bank accounts, furniture, documents. The small things were somehow worse than the big ones. A coffee mug Claire had bought on our second anniversary. A photograph from our first vacation. The blanket we'd used on winter nights. Every object seemed to ask the same question. How could something that once felt permanent become temporary? But whenever I started doubting myself, I remembered my mother waking up in that car. Then the doubt disappeared. On the 12th morning, I drove to the house on Briarwood Lane. Mom was in the kitchen. Dad was outside repairing something that didn't need repairing. I watched them through the window. They looked peaceful. Not completely healed, but peaceful. Mom had planted flowers along the walkway. Dad had already found a local mechanic who needed help rebuilding an old transmission. They were rebuilding their lives piece by piece. And I realized something. Maybe that was what family really meant. Not preventing someone from falling. Helping them stand again. I returned home that afternoon. Claire was sitting at the dining table. There were papers in front of her. She looked exhausted. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Then she said, "Sit down." I did. She pushed the papers toward me. "I've been thinking." "So have I." "No, Daniel. You haven't been thinking about this from my side." I didn't argue. She continued. I was put in an impossible position. I looked at her. My parents were standing outside our door after their house burned down. Exactly. And you were supposed to let them stay. I was supposed to make a decision about my own home without being consulted. I stared at her. They had nowhere else to go. That's not my fault. There it was again. That sentence. I had heard it before. I had spent days hoping I would never hear it again. But this time, something was different. I wasn't hurt. I was certain. Claire leaned back. You keep acting like I did something unforgivable. I took a slow breath. You did. She looked genuinely shocked. Because I didn't let them live here? No. I leaned forward. Because when they needed compassion, you gave them conditions. She shook her head. You're making me the villain. No. You did that yourself. Her eyes narrowed. Then she said something I never expected. If your parents mattered so much, why weren't you there? The room went completely still. I felt that sentence hit somewhere deep. I had been overseas. I had missed birthdays. I had missed holidays. I had missed ordinary evenings when my mother probably wished I were home. But I had been serving. And Claire knew that. You're blaming me, I said quietly, because I wasn't physically here when their house burned down. I'm saying you abandoned them too. I stared at her. Maybe she wanted me to get angry. Maybe she wanted me to defend myself. Instead, I felt something inside me finally let go. You're right about one thing. Claire waited. I wasn't there. I stood. But when I found out, I came. She said nothing. I drove straight to them. My voice became quieter. I didn't ask whether helping them would inconvenience me. I didn't ask how long it would take. I didn't ask what it would cost. I looked at the woman across from me. I just went. Claire's eyes became wet. Daniel. I shook my head. Don't. She wiped her cheek. After everything we've been through, you're really going to throw me away? That word stayed with me. Throw me away. As if our marriage were something I had casually discarded. As if I hadn't spent 12 days wondering whether I could somehow save it. I didn't throw you away, Claire. I reached into my folder. I finally stopped pretending you were someone you weren't. Her eyes fell to the papers. Then she understood. You filed. I nodded. She stared at me for several seconds. And then the anger vanished from her face. What replaced it was fear. Real fear. Daniel, please. That was the first time she had said please. Not when my parents were outside. Not when my mother was barefoot. Not when my father asked for one night. Now. Only now. I felt tears burning behind my eyes. Because a part of me had wanted those words so badly. I had wanted her to understand. I had wanted her to say she was sorry. But sometimes an apology arrives after the person who needed it has already learned how to live without it. I closed the folder. I hope someday you understand why this happened. Claire whispered, and if I don't? I looked at her one final time. Then I hope you at least remember that my parents didn't need you to save them. I walked toward the door. They only needed you to open it. Behind me, Claire began crying. I didn't turn around, because I knew if I did, I might remember the woman I fell in love with. And I had finally accepted that she was gone. But when I reached the driveway, my phone rang. It was Dad. And the news he gave me made me realize that the fire had taken something else from my parents that none of us had noticed yet. Dad's call wasn't about another disaster. It was about Lily. He told me Mom had finally decided she wanted to put her photograph somewhere she could see it every morning. I drove to Briarwood Lane that evening. When I arrived, Mom was standing in the living room holding Lily's picture. The cracked frame was still around it. I had bought a new wooden frame a few days earlier, but Mom had kept the damaged one in a drawer. She couldn't throw it away. I understood. Some objects stop being objects when they carry the last pieces of someone you love. Dad walked in carrying a small toolbox. I've got an idea, he said. He pointed toward the wall above the fireplace. Right there. Mom looked at the empty space. You think? Dad nodded. That's where she belongs. I helped him hang the new frame. We stepped back. For a moment, nobody spoke. Lily's photograph looked different there. Not trapped inside a damaged frame. Not sitting on a dashboard in a parking lot. Not surrounded by smoke. She was home again. Mom touched the bottom of the frame with her fingertips. There she is. Her voice broke on the last word. Dad nodded. There she is. I looked at my parents. They had lost their house. They had lost furniture, clothes, keepsakes, savings, and decades of ordinary memories. But somehow they were still standing. That night, Mom made dinner. Nothing special. Just roast chicken, potatoes, and vegetables. But sitting at that table felt more valuable than any expensive restaurant ever could. Dad told an old story about Lily stealing his favorite wrench when she was 16. Mom corrected every detail. Dad argued. Mom laughed. And for a few minutes, Lily was there again. Not physically, but in the way families keep people alive. Through stories. Through jokes. Through the little habits nobody else understands. I realized then that grief doesn't always disappear. Sometimes you simply learn how to carry it without letting it crush you. The divorce process continued. There were forms, meetings, conversations I never imagined having when I stood beside Claire on our wedding day. Some nights I was angry. Other nights I was sad. And occasionally I missed her. That was the part nobody warned me about. You can know someone made an unforgivable choice and still miss the person you thought they were. I mourned the beginning of our marriage. The early mornings. The vacations. The stupid jokes. The plans we made. I wasn't mourning what Claire had become. I was mourning what I had believed we were. But every time doubt returned, I remembered that parking lot. My father's hands covering mine without turning around. My mother's shoulders shaking silently when she saw me. Lily's photograph sitting between them. That memory always brought me back. A few weeks later, I was sitting on my parents' porch when Dad looked at me. You sure about this? I knew exactly what he meant. I nodded. Yeah. He looked toward the garden. Your mother thinks you're throwing away too much. She's allowed to think that. Dad smiled. She loves you. I know. He took a sip of coffee. Then he said something that stayed with me. Sometimes doing the right thing still hurts. I looked at him. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. The sun was going down beyond the houses. Mom was inside humming while she prepared dinner. And for the first time in months, my parents weren't surviving. They were living. Their house wasn't the one they had spent decades building. But Mom had flowers outside. Dad had worked nearby. Lily was above the fireplace. And I finally understood that home wasn't always the place you lost. Sometimes home was the people who stayed beside you after everything else was gone. The divorce would soon be final. I thought that would be the hardest day. I was wrong, because the hardest moment came later, when Dad mentioned Lily's name and made me laugh so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. And that was when I realized our family wasn't going back to the way it was. It was becoming something new, something smaller, something scarred, but something stronger. And on the night the divorce became official, I thought I was finally done grieving my marriage. Then Dad said something about Lily that brought back a memory I hadn't allowed myself to touch in 6 years. And that memory changed the way I understood everything that had happened. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday. I remember the day because I expected to feel relieved. Instead, I sat in my car afterward and stared through the windshield for nearly 20 minutes. My marriage was officially over. There was no more paperwork to sign. No more conversations about who was right. No more wondering whether Claire might eventually understand. I was free. But freedom doesn't always feel like freedom at first. Sometimes it feels like standing inside the ruins of a future you once believed was guaranteed. I was sad. Of course I was. There were years I couldn't simply erase. There were good memories. There were moments when Claire had made me laugh until my stomach hurt. There were plans we had made for the future. I mourned those things. But I didn't regret my decision. Not once. Because every time I questioned myself, I remembered my mother sleeping against that car window. I remembered my father's hand covering mine when I climbed into that back seat. And I remembered the reason they had been there. One closed door. That was all it took. A few weeks later, I was sitting on my parents' porch with Dad. It had become our routine. Coffee. Quiet. The evening air. Mom moving around inside the kitchen. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes we didn't. Dad and I had always been comfortable with silence. That night, he suddenly smiled. "You know," he said, "Lily would have made this situation much worse." I laughed. Much worse. She would have shown up at Claire's house with a camera. I laughed harder. She'd have brought signs. Professionally printed signs. Probably. Dad shook his head. She never knew how to do anything halfway. For a few seconds, we laughed like we used to. Then the laughter faded. Because Lily was still gone. 6 years had passed, but there was still an empty space where she should have been. Mom's voice floated through the screen door. She was humming while making dinner. The smell of roasted chicken drifted into the evening air. I looked at Dad. His eyes were fixed on the garden. "Do you ever think about what she would be doing now?" I asked. "All the time." I nodded. "So do I." Dad took another sip of coffee. "She'd probably tell you that you handled everything too quietly." I smiled. "She'd be right." Then Dad looked at me. "But she'd also be proud." Those words hit harder than I expected. I looked down at my hands. For months, I had wondered whether choosing my parents meant I had failed at marriage. Maybe I had lost something important. Maybe I had made the wrong decision. But sitting there with my father, I finally understood something. You don't measure the value of a decision by how painless it is. Sometimes the right decision is the one that hurts the most. My parents had rebuilt their lives. Mom's flowers were growing along the walkway. Dad had started helping neighbors with their cars again. Lily's photograph hung above the fireplace in a simple wooden frame. Their old house was gone. The cracked photograph frame was still tucked away somewhere. Some losses don't disappear. You simply learn to carry them. My marriage was gone too. I would probably miss parts of it for years. But I had gained something I hadn't realized I was risking. I had gained the certainty that when the people who raised me needed me, I showed up. That's what mattered. The fire took my parents home. Claire's decision took my marriage. But neither one took my family. And that's the lesson I carry with me. Because someday, your parents may call you when they're scared. They may be standing somewhere they never imagined standing. They may need you when helping them is inconvenient. When it costs money. When it disrupts your plans. When someone tells you their problems aren't your responsibility. And in that moment, you'll have a choice. You'll either open the door, or you'll close it. Claire didn't need to rebuild my parents' lives. She didn't need to become their caretaker. She didn't even need to understand their pain. She only needed to open the door. She chose not to. And everything that happened afterward came from that one choice. As for me, if I could go back to that Walmart parking lot, I wouldn't change a thing. I'd still open that car door. I'd still take my mother's hand. I'd still sit beside my father. I'd still bring them home. And if that choice cost me my marriage all over again, I'd pay the price without hesitation. Because some things are worth losing everything for. And sometimes the deepest proof of love isn't who stays when life is easy. It's who opens the door when everything has already burned down.